3 months ago, I went on what should have been a routine elk hunting trip with my father-in-law, Tom, in the Colorado Rockies. Tom's been hunting these mountains for 30 years. He knows every trail, every water source, every place the elk like to graze. So when he suggested we try a new area he'd heard about from some local hunters, I figured he knew what he was doing. The spot was about 15 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by an old mining trail that hadn't been maintained in decades. We hiked in on a crisp October morning, following elk sign through thick pine forests and across rocky ridges. The hunting was good. We saw several small herds and had a few opportunities for clean shots, but we were holding out for a big bull Tom swore was in the area. By the second day, we'd tracked a promising herd to the edge of a deep ravine filled with loose shale and the skeletal remains of burned trees from some long-ago forest fire. The elk trails led right to the rim and then seemed to vanish. Tom studied the ground for a while, then shrugged. They'd probably crossed over and headed up the other side. We'll pick up the trail in the morning. We made camp about 100 yards back from the ravine edge, in a relatively flat area protected by a semicircle of large granite boulders. As darkness fell, we got a fire going and settled into our sleeping bags under a canopy of stars so bright it almost hurt to look at them. That's when we first heard the humming. It started around midnight, a low, resonant sound that seemed to be coming from directly beneath us. At first I thought it might be wind blowing through some underground cave system, but there was something organic about it, something almost musical. It rose and fell in patterns that reminded me of singing, but no human voice could sustain notes that long or hit frequencies that low. Probably just gas escaping from some old mine shaft, Tom said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Sometimes trapped air makes weird noises when it finds a way out. But the humming didn't sound like escaping gas. It sounded deliberate, purposeful, like something underground was trying to communicate. And it was moving, traveling in long, slow circles beneath our campsite, as if whatever was making the sound was pacing back and forth in some vast underground chamber. As the night wore on, other sounds joined the humming. Long, deliberate scratching noises, like enormous fingernails being drawn across stone. Tapping sounds that came in complex rhythms, almost like Morse code. And underneath it all, so faint I thought I might be imagining it, something that sounded like whispers.
Unable to sleep, I pressed my ear to the ground and immediately regretted it. The sounds were much louder down there, and I could make out details that made my skin crawl. The whispers weren't in English. They weren't in any language I recognized. They had a wet, slithering quality that made me think of things that had never seen sunlight. And there were other voices too, human voices, calling out in what sounded like pain or terror. Around 2 a.m., the humming suddenly stopped. The silence was absolute and somehow more terrifying than the noise had been. Tom and I lay in our sleeping bags, straining our ears, waiting. That's when we heard the first scream. It was unmistakably human, a long, agonized wail that seemed to come from impossibly deep underground. It was followed by another scream and another, until it sounded like dozens of people were trapped somewhere beneath us, all crying out at once in a chorus of despair. "We need to get out of here," Tom whispered, his voice shaking. "Right now." We grabbed our essential gear and hiked out through the darkness, using our headlamps to navigate the treacherous trail. We didn't stop until we reached Tom's truck at sunrise, both of us exhausted and shaken. When we told our story to other hunters back in town, most of them just looked at us like we'd been drinking. But one old-timer, a guy named Earl, who'd been hunting these mountains since the 1960s, went visibly pale when we described the location. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "You boys camped right on top of the Perdition mine." He explained that there had been a silver mining operation in that area back in the 1880s, worked by Chinese immigrants and down-on-their-luck prospectors. In 1887, there was a catastrophic cave-in during the night shift. 32 men were trapped in the deepest tunnels, too far down for any rescue attempt. The thing is, Earl continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, according to the old records, those men didn't die right away. The mine owner could hear them down there for weeks, tapping on the rocks, trying to dig their way out. But toward the end, before the sounds finally stopped, the survivors who escaped said they could hear other things too. Singing, chanting, like the trapped men had found something else down there in the dark with them. I researched the Perdition Mine incident when I got home. The historical records confirmed Earl's story. 32 men died in the cave-in, and their bodies were never recovered because the tunnels were deemed too unstable. But buried in the archived newspaper accounts, I found something that still keeps me awake at night. In the final days before the voices from below went silent, the mine foreman reported that the trapped workers had stopped calling for help. Instead, they were heard singing in unison, songs in languages that none of the surface workers recognized. The last entry in the mine's logbook, written in the foreman's increasingly shaky handwriting, simply said, "They have learned new songs. God help us all, they have learned new songs." Sometimes late at night, I can still hear that underground humming. It follows me in my dreams, that low, resonant sound that spoke of things best left buried in the dark places of the earth.
Don't forget to like and subscribe if you dare to hear more chilling stories. This story is about my sister, Emma, and I'm still not sure I believe it myself, even after everything that's happened since. Emma is, or was, the most level-headed person I know. She's a nurse practitioner, rational, scientific-minded, not given to flights of fancy or supernatural thinking. She's also an experienced solo hiker who's been exploring remote wilderness areas for over 10 years without incident. Last October, Emma planned a 3-day solo backpacking trip to Mirror Lake, a remote alpine lake in the Cascade Mountains, about 4 hours from Seattle. It's not a particularly difficult hike, about 12 miles round trip, but the lake sits at over 6,000 feet elevation and is only accessible during a narrow window in late summer and early fall before the snow makes the trail impassable. Emma left on a Thursday morning and was supposed to check in with me via satellite communicator on Friday evening, then again on Saturday. When Friday's check-in didn't come, I wasn't too concerned. The terrain up there can be tricky for satellite signals. But when Saturday evening came and went without any word, I knew something was seriously wrong. Emma had never, not once in all her years of hiking, failed to stick to her communication schedule. I contacted Search and Rescue Sunday morning. A team went up the trail that afternoon and found Emma's car at the trailhead exactly where it should be. They hiked to Mirror Lake that evening and found Emma sitting on a large boulder at the water's edge, staring down at her own reflection in the perfectly still surface of the lake. She'd been sitting in that exact position for over 36 hours. The SAR team leader, a guy named Mike, who'd been doing mountain rescues for 20 years, told me later that Emma was in a state unlike anything he'd ever seen. She was severely dehydrated and showing early signs of hypothermia, but she wasn't unconscious or delirious. She was completely alert and responsive. She just wouldn't stop staring at the water and talking to her reflection as if it were a separate person. She kept saying there were 2 of her, Mike explained, one sitting on the rock and one in the lake, and she insisted the one in the lake was telling her things, important things she needed to remember. They had to physically carry Emma away from the lake. Even as they loaded her onto a stretcher, she kept turning her head back toward the water, calling out to what she said was the other Emma, and promising she would come back to finish their conversation. The doctors at the hospital attributed Emma's condition to a combination of severe dehydration, altitude sickness, and prolonged exposure to cold. Hallucinations weren't uncommon in cases of extreme dehydration, they explained. A few days of IV fluids and rest, and she'd be fine. But Emma wasn't fine.
even after she was physically recovered, she couldn't stop talking about Mirror Lake and the conversations she'd had with her reflection. According to her, the Emma in the lake had shown her things, visions of the future, secrets about our family, knowledge about events that hadn't happened yet. At first, we all assumed this was some kind of psychological trauma from her ordeal, but then Emma started making predictions that came true with disturbing accuracy. 3 days after she got out of the hospital, Emma called our mother and told her she needed to go see a doctor immediately, that something was wrong with her liver. Mom laughed it off. She felt fine, had no symptoms, no reason to think anything was wrong, but Emma was so insistent that Mom finally agreed to get some blood work done just to put her mind at ease. The tests came back showing elevated liver enzymes and markers that suggested early-stage cirrhosis. The doctor was amazed they'd caught it so early, before any symptoms had appeared. Emma just nodded when Mom called to tell her, like she'd been expecting it all along. A week later, Emma called my brother David and told him to get his brakes checked immediately, that his car was going to fail and he was going to have an accident on Highway 101 near the Shelton exit if he didn't. David thought she was having some kind of breakdown and tried to get her to see a therapist. 3 days later, his brakes failed completely while he was driving to work, and he ended up in a ditch exactly where Emma had said he would. If he hadn't been going slowly due to heavy traffic, he could have been killed. Emma told me she still dreams about Mirror Lake every single night. In the dreams, she's back on that boulder, talking to her reflection in the water. But now she says there are other reflections there too, faces she doesn't recognize, all staring up at her from the depths of the lake, all trying to tell her things about what's coming. The lake remembers everyone who's ever looked into it, Emma told me during one of our conversations. Her voice was distant, like she was speaking from very far away. Every person who's ever seen their reflection in that water becomes part of it somehow. And once you're part of it, you can see things, past things, future things, things that are happening right now in other places. Last month, Emma told me she was going back to Mirror Lake. I tried everything I could think of to talk her out of it, offered to go with her, suggested she see a therapist first, even threatened to call the police. But she just smiled and said the other Emma was waiting for her, that there were more things she needed to learn. You don't understand. Mirror Lake isn't just a lake, it's a window, and I've been looking through it for months now, even when I'm not there. I can see so much, and I need to see more. I drove up to Mirror Lake last weekend, hoping to convince her to come home. The hike was more difficult than I had expected. The trail was steep and poorly marked, and by the time I reached the lake, it was nearly sunset. Mirror Lake is exactly as Emma described it, a perfect oval of dark water surrounded by granite peaks, so still it looks like polished obsidian. Your reflection appears in the water with supernatural clarity, every detail sharp and precise, even in the dim light. I found Emma sitting on the same boulder that the search and rescue team had found her months earlier. She looked older, thinner, but there was something else different about her, a kind of otherworldly awareness in her eyes, like she was seeing things the rest of us couldn't. "You knew you'd come," she said without turning around. "The other Emma told me you'd come." I sat beside her and looked down at the water. Our reflections stared back at us, perfectly normal at first, but the longer I looked, the more I became convinced that something was off. My reflection seemed to move just a fraction of a second after I moved, like it was copying me rather than mirroring me. And Emma's reflection was smiling, even though Emma herself wasn't. "Do you see them?" Emma asked quietly. "The others?" I looked deeper into the water and felt my breath catch in my throat. There were other faces down there, dozens, maybe hundreds, all staring up at us from impossible depths. Men, women, children, all with the same otherworldly awareness I'd seen in Emma's eyes.
I looked for maybe 10 seconds before I had to turn away, my heart pounding. But in that brief glimpse, I understood why Emma couldn't leave. The faces in the water weren't just reflections, they were windows into other possibilities, other versions of reality, other times and places where different choices had been made. Emma is still there, as far as I know. I've tried going back twice, but each time I get within a mile of the lake, I'm overcome with a feeling of dread so intense that it makes me physically sick. It's like some part of me knows that if I look into that water again, I'll see too much, learn too much, and I'll never be able to leave either. Sometimes I wonder if Emma is happy there, or if she's trapped. But then I remember the smile on her reflection's face, and I think maybe happiness and being trapped aren't mutually exclusive. Maybe Mirror Lake gives you exactly what you've always wanted to know, and the price is that once you know it, you can never unknow it. All I know for certain is that I'm never going back there. And if you ever find yourself hiking in the Cascades and come across a perfectly still alpine lake that shows your reflection with disturbing clarity, do yourself a favor and don't look too long. Some things are better left unseen.
Don't forget to like and subscribe if you dare to hear more chilling stories. This happened to me personally just 6 weeks ago, and I'm still trying to make sense of what I experienced. I've been hiking solo in the Appalachian Mountains for over 15 years, and I thought I knew these trails better than my own neighborhood. The AT section near Shenandoah National Park is practically my backyard. I've hiked every mile of it dozens of times. I was planning a simple overnight trip, nothing ambitious, just a 20-mile loop that would take me up to a ridge I particularly love, where you can see for miles across the valley. It was late November, cold but clear, with that crisp mountain air that makes you feel alive, perfect hiking weather. I started early Saturday morning from the Thornton Gap parking area, following the familiar white blazes of the Appalachian Trail. The first few miles were exactly as I remembered. Rocky terrain through thick forest, past the old stone foundations of long-abandoned homesteads. I made good time and reached the junction where I needed to turn off onto the blue-blazed side trail that would take me up to my planned camping spot. That's where things started to go wrong. The blue blazes were there, painted on trees exactly as they should be, but something felt different. The trail seemed narrower than I remembered, more overgrown. The forest was too quiet, no bird songs, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, just the sound of my boots on the leaf-covered path and my own increasingly heavy breathing. After about an hour of hiking, I realized I should have reached the first landmark, a distinctive rock formation that looks like a giant's chair. But there was no sign of it. The trail just kept winding through endless forest, always climbing, never leveling off or providing any views. I checked my GPS, but it showed my location as a blank gray area with no topographic features marked. I figured the GPS was malfunctioning. It happens sometimes in deep forest with heavy tree cover, but I had my paper map and compass as backup, and according to them, I should have been at least 2 miles past where I actually seemed to be. The trail wasn't matching the map at all. By late afternoon, I was seriously concerned. I had been hiking for over 8 hours and hadn't encountered a single familiar landmark. The trail showed no signs of other hikers, no footprints, no broken branches, no trash or other evidence of human passage. It was like I was the first person to ever walk this path. That's when I noticed the blazes were changing. What had started as normal blue painted rectangles on trees were gradually becoming something else. The paint looked older, faded, and the shapes were slightly different, more elongated, sometimes tilted at odd angles. Some of them had additional marks I didn't recognize, small symbols scratched into the bark below the painted blazes. As darkness began to fall, I realized I had no choice but to make camp wherever I was. I found a relatively flat spot beside the trail and set up my tent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was somewhere I shouldn't be. The forest around me felt ancient and untouched, like I'd somehow stepped back in time to before humans had ever walked these mountains. That night, I barely slept. The silence was absolute. No wind in the trees, no night sounds, nothing. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps on the trail outside my tent. Slow, deliberate steps, like someone walking very carefully through the darkness. The footsteps approached my campsite, paused for what felt like an eternity, then continued past. I waited until I heard them fade away before unzipping my tent to look outside. In the beam of my flashlight, I could see fresh footprints in the soft earth of the trail. They were human footprints, but wrong somehow. Too narrow, too long, with toes that extended farther than they should have.
The footprints were heading in the direction I'd been traveling, the same direction I planned to go in the morning. When dawn finally came, I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of continuing forward on the trail, I was going to retrace my steps back to the parking area. Something was fundamentally wrong with this place, and I needed to get out. But when I tried to hike back the way I'd come, the trail was gone. Where there had been a clear path the day before, there was now just dense forest. No blazes, no beaten earth, no sign that a trail had ever existed. I spent 2 hours searching the area around my campsite, but it was like the trail I'd followed for 8 hours had simply vanished overnight. Fighting panic, I pulled out my GPS again. This time it was working, and it showed my location clearly. According to the satellite reading, I was standing in the middle of unbroken wilderness, at least 5 miles from the nearest marked trail. There was no record of any trail system in this area at all. I struck out cross-country, using my compass to head due east toward where I knew the main Appalachian Trail had to be. The hiking was brutal. Thick underbrush, steep terrain, and fallen trees that forced me to constantly detour. But after 3 hours of desperate bushwhacking, I finally saw those familiar white blazes painted on an oak tree ahead of me. I've never been so happy to see anything in my life. I followed the AT south back to Thornton Gap, reaching the parking area just before sunset. The ranger at the visitor center told me something that still gives me chills. When I described where I thought I'd been hiking, he looked at me strangely and said there was no blue-blazed trail in that area. "Never has been," he said. "That whole section is designated wilderness. No official trails, no camping permitted. Folks do get lost in there sometimes, but we always tell people to stay on the marked trails." I showed him my photos from the hike, pictures of the strange blazes, the narrow trail, the endless forest. In every single photo, there was no trail visible, just trees and undergrowth. Even the blazes I'd photographed directly didn't show up in the images. When I got home, I researched the area extensively. What I found made my blood run cold. In the 1800s, there had been a small settlement in approximately the area where I'd been hiking. The residents had abandoned it suddenly in 1847, leaving behind all their possessions. Local records from the time mentioned strange reports from the area. Travelers claiming to have found roads and paths that led nowhere. Compasses spinning wildly. People becoming lost for days in terrain they knew well. The settlement was called Perdition Hollow, and according to one old newspaper account, the last residents claimed they were being led astray by false paths that appeared in the night and vanished with the dawn. 3 weeks ago, I tried to find the area again, approaching it from a different direction.
I hiked for an entire day through the wilderness area, using GPS coordinates to guide me to the exact location where I'd made camp. But there was nothing there, just pristine forest that showed no signs of ever having been disturbed. Sometimes I wonder if I actually experienced what I remember, or if something happened to me out there that my mind is trying to make sense of. But then I look at my hiking boots, and I can see the wear patterns that don't match any trail I've ever hiked. I can see the small tears in my pack from branches that shouldn't have been there. And sometimes late at night, I dream about those narrow blazes and the sound of footsteps following me through a forest that may or may not exist. In the dreams, I'm still walking that impossible trail, and I can never find my way back to the world I know.
Last week, another hiker at the visitor center mentioned he'd gotten turned around in the wilderness area and found what looked like an old trail marked with faded blue blazes. The ranger told him the same thing he told me. There are no blue blaze trails in that area, never have been. But the hiker insisted he'd followed the blazes for hours before realizing he was completely lost. He said the strangest thing about it was how quiet the forest was, like he'd stepped into a place where sound itself couldn't exist. I didn't talk to that hiker directly, but I wanted to. I wanted to ask him if he'd seen the footprints too, if he'd noticed how the blazes seemed to change as he walked. Most of all, I wanted to warn him never to go back there, no matter how curious he might be. Because some trails don't lead anywhere you want to go. And some of them, once you've walked to them, never really let you leave.
If these stories sent chills down your spine, don't vanish into the darkness without hitting that like button. Share your scariest experience in the comments below, because your story might be featured next. And remember, the scariest thing is missing out. So subscribe now, before the next nightmare finds you.